Saturday morning, 1973. You're on the carpet, a comic open to the back page, and half the spread is an advert. A tiny underwater kingdom, crowned creatures waving from a castle. You send off your pocket money and wait 6 weeks. What arrives is a sachet of dust. You tip it into a glass on the kitchen windowsill, and, after the wait, you get specks, tiny, almost invisible specks, floating in the water. That was sea monkeys. I've got 25 toys like that here. Things that made no sense, didn't work properly, and somehow ended up in every home in the country. Most of them you haven't thought about in years, but the second I name them, you'll remember every one. Mechanical failures first. The John Bull printing outfit was a box of tiny rubber letters, a pair of tweezers, an ink pad, and a wooden stamper. The idea was painstaking. Pick up each letter with the tweezers, set it in a frame, press it into the ink, and stamp out headlines. The problem was, you were 6 years old. Your hands were the size of sausage rolls. The letters were smaller than your little fingernail. The ink smeared on your fingers, your shirt, the table, and occasionally a small blue smudge made it onto the paper. Your finished newspaper looked like it had been put together by someone having a medical episode. That's how many British homes spent their Christmas morning, doing unpaid typesetting with frozen fingers and blue ink up to their elbows. Gonks were small, round, furry things with googly eyes. They didn't do anything. You couldn't cuddle them properly. The shape was wrong, so they just sat on a shelf staring. Ringo Starr had one. Peter Sellers had one. You had one. Nobody has ever been able to explain why. You didn't play with a gonk. You simply owned one. The Tressie doll had a hole in the top of her head. You pressed her belly button, and a lock of hair came out through the hole. You turned a key in her back to wind it back in. Pushed too much out, and it never quite went right again. The entire selling point of the doll was a mechanical fault you couldn't fix. 1964 and 1979. A different kind of novelty, the stylophone. If you ever heard a sound like an angry wasp trapped in a biscuit tin, that was it. A tiny metal keyboard you played with a metal pen. It was invented in Britain in 1967, sold on television as a genuine musical instrument, and David Bowie actually used one on Space Oddity and somehow made it sound like the future. In your front room on a Sunday afternoon, it sounded like anything but. Your dad lasted about 4 minutes before leaving the room. Your mom lasted 3. You carried on regardless, dragging that pen across the metal strips, convinced you were onto something. Some toys were outright hazardous. Picture a child wearing a hat with a weighted propeller on top, rotating their head in circles. That was the swing wing, sold as a hula hoop for your head. It came out in 1965 and was eventually pulled from sale because children were getting dizzy and hurting themselves, which, looking back, should probably have come up during the planning stage. Then the spud gun. You pushed the barrel of a plastic pistol into a raw potato to load it, pulled the trigger, and a small disc of spud fired out at your brother. About 3 feet of range, it stung more than you'd expect. The Lone Star version also fired caps and worked as a water pistol, so it had 3 jobs and didn't do any of them particularly well. You could buy one from Woolworth for pennies. We used up King Edward potatoes for ammunition, and nobody thought twice about it. And then there was the stunt cycle. The Evil Canoval, sometimes written Carnival, stunt cycle, came out in 1973, and within months it was the must-have toy in the country. You slotted the figure onto the bike, clicked the bike into a red plastic launcher, and cranked the handle. Crank for a full minute, knuckles scraping the carpet. Then you pressed the button, and Evil shot forward at speed. He flew off the kitchen table. You built a ramp out of a hardback encyclopedia and a plank from the shed. He flew off that too, but sideways, into the skirting board. The amount of effort you put into cranking versus the time he actually stayed upright was genuinely terrible. Every living room carpet in Britain got tire marks on it in 1974. His head came off within the first fortnight, and over 80,000 people watched the real Evel Knievel try to jump 13 buses at Wembley in May 1975. Nobody cared, you just kept cranking. Now, toys that promised education and delivered play. Felt boards. Felt shapes pressed onto a board to make a farm. Take it apart and make a farm again. Millions of parents bought it because it was supposed to be educational. Ask anyone who had one, and they will tell you it was brilliant. Spirograph was invented by a British engineer named Dennis Fisher. It went on sale in 1965 and won Toy of the Year in 1967. The patterns it made were genuinely beautiful, perfect geometric swirls that looked like something from an art gallery, right up until the gear slipped. You'd be on the very last loop of a perfect design when the wheel would skip and a thick blue biro line dragged across the middle. When it worked, it was miraculous. When it failed, it was ruined. Tiny Tears from Palatoy cried real tears and wet herself when you fed her water. Palatoy won awards for this. The marketing said, "Just like a real baby." Parents bought millions of them. It was the best-selling doll in Britain for years. You'd feed her water from a tiny bottle. She'd cry, she'd wet her nappy, and then you'd do it all again, looking after a real baby, but on purpose, for fun. Assembly-obsessed toys. Mousetrap had 20-odd plastic parts: the boot, the bucket, the ball, the bathtub, the diving man, the cage at the end. You'd spend 45 minutes putting it together, following the picture on the box because the instructions were useless. You'd set it off. Something always jammed. The ball got stuck halfway down the chute, the diver missed the tub, the cage didn't drop. You'd flick the last piece by hand and pretend the whole thing had gone perfectly. Weebles were egg-shaped figures with a weight in the bottom so they couldn't fall over. Push them, and they righted themselves. Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. A haunted house, a fun and children would sit pushing them for 20 minutes, completely happy. The magic drawing board was another exercise in awkward controls. One knob moved left and right, the other up and down. A diagonal needed both at once, simple in theory, but one of the most stressful experiences of childhood. Boxes and staircases were easy. Everything else was a fight. Weapons and the war room fantasies followed. 7 guns in one toy, over 3 feet long. That was the Johnny 7 one-man army, the best-selling boys' toy of 1964. Grenade launcher, rocket, cap pistol, machine gun. It rattled, it clipped, it fired small plastic things across rooms, and nobody at all questioned whether a primary school child needed something the size of a small cannon. If your parents ever heard steel ball bearings hitting plastic at speed, they'd know crossfire was out again. 2 pistol-shaped launchers on opposite sides of a small plastic arena. Fire away and listen to hailstones on a biscuit tin. You'd lose every single bearing under the sofa within 10 minutes, and the game was done. Parents hated it. Children loved it. By 1979, the future had arrived in the toy aisle. Big Track was a large white plastic tank with a keypad on the back. You programmed it to move forward, turn, and fire a laser, which was actually a torch bulb. In theory, you were a military commander. In practice, you'd spend 45 minutes programming 12 moves, press go, and it would drive straight into the skirting board. It ran on D batteries that lasted about 40 minutes. Smaller, obsessive loves. If your parents ever took one look at your Saturday afternoon and saw glue on your fingers, you'd had an Airfix moment. Tiny plastic pieces, a tube of glue that could strip varnish, instructions drawn as if you were an engineer. Pieces still on their frames. The glue went on your fingers first, then on the wings. Your finished Spitfire looked like it had been in a dogfight before it left the box. Dad would take over, promising to do it properly, and somehow make it worse. Sabutio demanded the iron. You laid the green felt flat on the dining table, pressed it smooth, and only then could you flick tiny plastic footballers at a ball the size of a pea. The pitch never quite ironed flat. Every game had the same argument about whether it was a goal or the felt's fault. The players snapped. The goalposts fell over. You spent more time setting it up than actually playing, and yet it was one of the most loved toys in the country. Corgi's Aston Martin DB5 was British manufacturing at full tilt. In the 7 weeks before Christmas 1965, a Swansea factory couldn't keep up. 10,000 a day, workers on extra shifts, and nearly 4 million were sold altogether. It had pop-up machine guns, a bulletproof rear shield, and the famous ejector seat. The tiny passenger that flew out was gone under the sofa, behind the radiator, never seen again. The Raleigh Grifter came out in 1976, grips like a motorbike throttle, fat tires, a frame built like scaffolding. It weighed roughly the same as a small horse. Going uphill took everything you had. Going downhill, you just held on and hoped. It split a generation, Grifter Kid or Chopper Kid, and the argument over which was better still rages in Facebook groups. Stretch Armstrong, a large, muscular man in small blue trunks filled with something nobody could identify. You could stretch him, and he'd slowly pull back, except But children everywhere tried to stretch him further until a puncture released a thick, sticky goo across the carpet. He came out in 1976. What was inside him was corn syrup gel. The Slinky was a coiled metal spring sold on the promise of walking downstairs. In a British semi with thick carpet, it managed one step, kinked, and became a twisted mess of sharp metal that lived at the bottom of the toy cupboard for years. Once it had a kink, it was finished. Saturday morning, 1973, same comic, same promise. A tiny underwater kingdom. What arrives is a sachet of dust and a few specks called sea monkeys. You accepted it and moved on. The spirograph would skip. The evil Knievel would fly sideways off the table. None of it worked the way it was supposed to, but you played with it anyway. These imperfect objects matter because they left a shared footprint, nostalgia, rituals, arguments, and triumphs that turned into a common memory across living rooms and lofts. If that brought one back for you, tell us which one you had, which one hit you the hardest, and who else grew up with any of these. Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down.